Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, wherever you are. My name is Aaron Roberts. I'm one of the executive members of the UK OSINT community, and I'm delighted to be here today with Michael McCabe from Crowdthreat, who are a open source intelligence-led incident awareness platform. Thanks so much for your time and for joining us today. I'm really interested in both like the background of the application that you're building, why it came about, and also like how you see it working in real time as it grows and develops. Because at the moment you're in beta, right?
Yeah, we're about 3 weeks into beta testing now. So like with crowdsourcing, it's like my previous company was Intelligence Fusion, and I set that up in 2014. In part because there wasn't really intelligence platforms around at the time. A lot of intelligence was being put into Word documents, PDF, to then send out to clients once at like 6 p.m. So this was kind of the year when a lot of the sort of market leaders were sort of starting to develop their platforms. Now, I mean, like part of the reason why I set Intelligence Fusion was, and my background is I'm ex-intelligence core. Then I went to work in the private security sector in Iraq. And certainly when we were working in Basra, we used to have a Skype group chat where we'd share information. So an ID would go off in Basra and someone would chip in and say, I've heard a device has gone off. And throughout the day, you'd have sort of security managers, intelligence people in the province, and we'd come to some sort of consensus as to what happened. And that's what I came away from Iraq in 2011. That's why isn't it sitting there globally? Why can't I just tap into a global network of people that have real local cultural fluency? And that was kind of, I've always had an interest in crowdsourcing, but that's not really where Intelligence Fusion went. We eventually had about 20 full-time analysts trying to collate all of the incidents that are happening in the world, which obviously is impossible. So I sold Intelligence Fusion 3 years ago to an American risk management company, and I have wanted to really try crowdsourcing properly. So this is my attempt to actually see if crowdsourcing can solve the issue of creating a single unified platform where you can see every threat that's happening around the world with real local cultural fluency.
Oh, amazing. I guess my immediate thoughts to that are, I know, having been in and around the space now for way too many years, the idea of using a platform like X, is formerly Twitter, before the API disappeared forever for most use cases, like was both really useful when something was happening, trying to get information, but there is that flip side of that argument where immediately there's also quite a lot of disinformation, which can be very unintentional, and people just try and share a message of something they've seen or like an image or a video, but that really muddies the waters really quickly. I think like from what you said there, the idea that actually if you had like a dedicated network of people that are committed purely and interested in purely like this field and providing that relevant information, you're almost doing like a level of vetting without having to do a level of vetting, where you're already getting like the right kinds of data and the right kind of information because you know what the purposes of the platform where you're providing it to, rather than just doing it for like, I guess, internet points.
Exactly. Misinformation, disinformation used to just be text based, whereas now we're getting to the point where if AI is creating images and videos that are so realistic and audio is so realistic. This is really going to be a massive issue. I was chatting to one of the intelligence leads for one of the AI companies, and you'd imagine their answer would be, well, AI is going to solve all of this. And their answer was they actually see a future where they're going to need trusted, verified human networks around the world who you can tap into and start asking them questions of saying, look, we've seen this incident in Sudan or wherever it is, can you confirm if this is accurate? Because you actually got a proximity to that incident. So I think there is a heyday coming for the crowd, but also it's how the other companies have developed. Everybody's essentially using humans and technology to try and collate a global feed of data. Either they'll do it completely manually, or they'll use some sort of data scraping. And now we're heading towards a situation where you've got sort of market leaders who are essentially buying data feeds, running them through natural language processing, and then doing some generative AI of them. So essentially summarisation based on the data set that you hold. And then we're now kind of moving towards trying to do predictive intelligence and then using agentic AI to kind of take away some of the manual tasks of actually collating information that sort of brings that threat to life. Whereas I'm kind of going in the opposite direction. I'm kind of heading towards the humans. And I think I think there's a key issue within the intelligence sector at the moment where it's very Western-centric, mainly because of how the intelligence functions have grown out of the conflicts that we were part of in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's a real lack of local cultural fluency. So I think we miss a massive part of what's actually happening around the world. I mean, I worked in Iraq for 3 years. Me based on a military camp in Kandahar province. What do I actually know about Iraqi culture and Iraqis? And I think that could be done at a global level. So I think there's a real opportunity to create a crowdsourced platform where you build a global network of people who are providing threat data that is accurate, it's timely, and it actually has local cultural.
No, that's a really interesting model as well, because in the cyberspace, I use using the agentic AI quite a lot. But everything you just said, I'm like, I like the agentic AI to help me with like taking the sheer amount of data, like distilling it down to what's actually important in that data, and then allowing the human analyst to actually look at it, either verify what's being suggested, or then be able to do like further analysis based off what the agent has told you. And I think very much similar to you, I'm like, you still need the human at the end of that process regardless, because you can't trust the output 100%. And even like testing, like just yesterday, I was getting results back where I'm like, that doesn't feel accurate. And sure enough, I follow it and I'm like, yeah, that's made up. There's something we need to do with the training. And I think if you went solely down that route, especially taking things off like social media platforms as gospel, I think maybe I don't know if you'll be more likely to see the AI sort of make those mistakes or not identify something as patently false, or if it might be really, really good at it. But I think ultimately you still need a human to look at this content and sort of look at, verify and understand what might be going on. And I think your point there around cultures and stuff is also really interesting. Because given the way as well, like you could be on a military camp in a location anywhere from a few months to a couple of years. You probably don't integrate with the culture very much because you're there to do a job. And when you're not doing a job, you're probably on a camp surrounded by people that are more like you than a completely different country. And I guess what's really interesting for me there is, I noticed on your platform as well, you talk around potentially paying people who contribute to the platform as well.
We do.
Which I think is really interesting because it's not then just a case of having volunteers. It's people that can actually potentially make some kind of living, especially if they live in a area like you mentioned, Sudan, where there is a lot of conflict and the likelihood of something happening and needing somebody on the ground who can provide useful and verified information becomes that much more important.
There's the platforms that are out there at the moment and they're basically buying in data feeds historically from the likes of X. They're essentially doing crowdsourcing, but it's with a passive crowd. They're basically taking the data that the crowd are putting out there, or the users are putting out there, digesting it, putting it into their platform, and then spitting it out to their users. All I'm doing is just kind of changing the model. Whereas, like, I think it's a real opportunity to change how intelligence intellectual property is actually owned and valued. So, like, the first step for us is just to let's create an actual global threat monitoring system that actually covers the entire globe. And for every threat that you provide, we pay you, and we pay you. So we incorporate gamification because it's the best way to kind of get humans to actually engage with this. So based on the speed of you reporting a threat to us from when it occurred, the more that we pay you. And we also have an incentivization within the platform of like a bonus scheme. So every month, the top 3 reporters who've scored the highest levels, that's not based on the quantity of threats, it's based on the value. So you could be someone who's reported, say, 100 threats that have occurred within the sort of 24 to 48-hour window, whereas you might have someone who's got 20 that have occurred within the 15-minute window of occurring. And what this is actually leading to is sort of competitive collation, is how I put it, where you have an active crowd who are trying to do the quickest to actually get that threat into the system. And I know, from previously having an intelligence company that basically worked on a model of having multiple analysts on a rotational system. So we do an intelligence collection plan with the client that would sort of sit within the system.
So can you tell me a bit more about the competitive collation and how like you're gamifying the process of providing intelligence? And I guess from my own research, how do you see that working like on the ground with somebody as well? Because it'd be really interesting how that might work in like, I guess, in real time.
So we've seen it recently with, obviously we're beta testing 3 weeks in and we've got a fairly smallish crowd. But I mean, I'm already seeing that there's some days we're kind of almost hitting 200 incidents a day. We're only 3 weeks in. But what I'm seeing is with certain sort of major incidents that we're seeing around the world, I might get 2 or 3 reports from different threat reporters within the platform. And so that whole competitive collation on the gamification side, they're essentially trying to be the quickest to report that when it occurs, because a higher hint in relation to it. And that for me is, it proves the model and it proves the gamification element of it. The next stage for us is just to scale it. Once you actually sort of scale that from, we have just over 100 people signed up to be part of the crowd. I eventually want that to be in the thousands of people around the world reporting threats on the platform, and that competitive collation. Because we're basically, our model is that the quicker you are, the more we're going to pay for that threat. Should give us an actual real-time threat intelligence view. Because I see so many platforms out there we're seeing we do real-time. You really probably don't. You're kind of you're processing it. Yes, you're sort of getting it from probably using technology and from online events to get it onto your platform. But if your clients then have to kind of fact check 90% of what is coming through to you, can you actually act on it in real time? I think is a big question. So I think there's a real opportunity with crowdsourcing to kind of completely flip the model. But I think just more broadly, there's a couple of issues that I kind of see. One is it's the whole black box problem when it comes to AI. The AI gives you an answer, but you don't really know how it came to that answer. And from an intelligence perspective, that's really difficult for me, because I need to know, how did we get from A to B? And you can do that when it's humans in the loop. The other one is, I was listening to a talk by the CEO of Crowdthreat, and he was talking about this sort of breaking the granny bargain. So historically, Google would scrape 2 of your pages and send you 1 visitor to your website. Whereas now you kind of look at like Gemini, where they'll sort of scrape 1,500 pages and send you 1 visitor. I mean, Anthropic is like 60,000 pages to 1 visitor. So, we kind of assume when it comes to open source intelligence that open source is always going to be there and exactly the same quality that we've become used to it. What happens when people realize that they're not getting visitors, they're not getting people coming to their platform? Is there a potential that we're going to have some sort of open source sort of breakdown where we just don't have the data anymore that's out there? And when that happens, I mean, you see it now with news services. You cannot go to a news website that is not just absolutely cluttered with adverts. And that shows you that's a sign of the times. And that's why I think crowdsourcing can be really powerful as well, by changing that sort of intellectual property model of owning intelligence or providing intelligence and going out to the cloud and actually getting them to provide the data to you. I think that's a way around this issue.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it as well, I think. And I guess part of that comes around as well, like, I guess the term I keep saying is like the enshittification of everything. And I think you get, like, with the internet, you see that happening where platforms get to a point, like a certain saturation of users. People are like, this is a fantastic platform. And then somebody, usually the money people, are like, well, now you have to return on our investment because we need to see something for it. And then before you know it, yeah, like you said, either you're getting inundated with ads, or features getting paywalled, or features getting removed because they just don't bring any like monetary value. And therefore it doesn't matter who found it useful or why they were using it. It just ultimately comes down to like, well, we need to make this a viable business, or it goes poof overnight. And there we are. And in the open source space, that's really difficult. I guess TweetDeck's a really good example of that, where you could be really focused on like certain searches and you could have all your flows like visual right in front of you. And then overnight, no, that's now behind a paywall. And because you've decided that you think Elon is a far right nutter, you're not going to pay for that anymore. So good luck to you. And then you're like, oh, well, I'll try Blue Sky. And then Blue Sky does not have the same sort of functionality. And indeed, I think like the TweetDeck equivalent on Blue Sky was a third party solution, I think. And then obviously like the sheer amount of data is just nowhere near what you would have get found on X. And I think that's kind of thing make this whole process really difficult. Interesting, like, so you see you have around 100 analysts at the moment in the beta. I was just wondering, like, geographically, how that's spread out. Did you pick on like specific regions, or have you gone truly global for this?
Uh, it was a question that we sort of asked ourselves at the beginning. It's do we kind of focus on specific geography, or do we just open it to the entire world? And I think opening it to the entire world was the right choice, because I can't force where we're going to actually get the crowd members from. But geographically speaking, so far we've got people in America, in Nigeria, in India, like we're already starting to see a fairly global crowd that's emerging. And what's going to take in 12 months? The moment we're kind of almost hitting 200 threats a day. In 12 months' time, will we be outperforming the competitors that are out there, and just how broad is the scale? I always kind of looked at intelligence as having sort of 6 key features. Ideally, what you want is breadth. So you have a platform that has a global feed of data, which I just don't think is out there. The speed is clearly, and that's where a lot of the sort of competitive tension happens around some of the market leaders about saying, well, we're actually the quickest to get you the data. The accuracy is really key. How accurate is your data? Do I actually have to fact check it before I actually act on it? Ideally, it's also sort of, are you just getting the initial breadcrumbs of a threat, or are you getting the full story? And that's the ideal situation, when you get the full story. But then also, is it just, are you just providing threat data, or are you actually providing analysis that goes with that? And I don't think there's enough of that in the sector at the moment. I think there are certain companies out there who do really good analysis. But I don't think there's a solution out there that does the sort of the tactical, the operational, strategic level intelligence, and covers it all within a single system. And the last one is the predictive element. How predictive are platforms actually doing when it comes to intelligence? I think all of those issues come back to, you have to have that base level of tactical data. And that's what we're trying to build now with Crowdthreat, and obviously using identification and putting the crowd members. At the moment we're Web 2, but what I find really interesting is the potential for Web 3 and what that can do in the intelligence space. Everyone kind of talks about sort of tokenization and smart contracts, but just as one example, I'll see people sort of post incidents on X, and that we perhaps images of videos of an incident, and then below that you'll have in the comment section of news agencies, and they're saying, can we use this? We'll give you credit for it. Well, they're not going to get any financial element to that. Well, why don't you actually create a smart contract of that image or that video, and every single time a news agency or that image or video is ever used, then you get paid for that? That's where I think we're going from an intelligence perspective. I think it's going to be completely decentralized, and you'll perhaps come to a platform like Crowdthreat, and you'll do however many threats a month. We've got some people who've earned like £250 in like 2 weeks, and then we'll also get like a £500 bonus payment as well. But also then you can move to, well, actually I'm a subject matter expert on Iraq. So I currently produce a weekly report, so I'll put it into your platform, I'll create a smart contract, and then people can buy it and have it through the system. That's where I think things are going to go. I think it's going to be completely decentralized. They're going to use things like Web3 technologies to allow the content creators to own their own intellectual property and actually make money from that.
Yeah, that's a really, you kind of just answered the next question I was lining up for you there, which is annoying. But I saw something similar in the cyber threat intelligence space a few years ago. A friend of mine had built a platform, and his idea there was very similar, where it was like effectively like a marketplace where you could almost provide, like, I've got intelligence about like this subject or like this threat group or this malware, and people could then buy that specific intelligence directly from you as a, I guess, like a sole proprietor, really, which I thought was a really interesting model. And I think unfortunately never really went anywhere, like long term. But like what you've just said, I still think like, yeah, the decentralization can be really interesting, particularly at that global scale. And I guess the question I was going to ask you there was, because you talked around like doing the tactical, operational, strategic level reporting. And I guess at this stage, it sounds like everything is very tactical because it's on the ground and this is what's happening here in this location right now. But I was going to ask, like, do you see a point where people will actually start doing those more, I guess, broader pieces of reporting and stuff, and maybe providing like that strategic outlook, saying like, okay, well, I've written all this tactical reports over the last 6 months. Here's how I see the situation now and what I think is going to happen over time based off my, like, I guess, lived experience predominantly for people in those.
I do, and I think if you have that foundation of tactical data that you can draw off, then that essentially shows your homework. That shows your notes. You know, it's like, say if I was to look at Afghanistan, I was to say, right, I'm going to write a high-level strategic piece about how, you know, the Taliban are doing since they sort of retook over Afghanistan. If I can then link that to tactical level data of actually showing, you know, well, this is actually where they've had conflict or issues or these sorts of things, then for me, that's a lot more valuable because your strategic level assessment is actually backed up by tactical level data. And that's what I'd want to do. Like, you know, at the moment, the platform, we do have a freemium element to it where you can actually access data that sits between the 48 and the 6 hour window. But I'd like to, when we move to Web3, is actually have the ability for content creators to be able to come on and actually write high level assessments, but use our tactical level data to kind of back up what they're writing about. So if you do some sort of, you know, I'm going to write an assessment, and actually these are kind of 3 scenarios that I've generated. These are the indicators and warnings attached to them. That could be a very static document just sat in a Word document, or you could make it very technical and visual, and actually it's run through the technology. And this for me is where AI could be really, really useful, because you could actually create your scenarios, create your indicators and warnings, and actually say, well, based on the tactical level data, we actually think that we're moving towards scenario 1 in the situation. So I think there's so many different ways you can sort of move intelligence forward. But for me, the foundational layer is always going to be that tactical level. That's always where I've kind of sat with certainly with my previous company and now for Alfred. But I was listening to the guy who created LinkedIn. He was saying, and we can see this now, the future job market, it's no longer you get a job, you're in it for 30 years and then you retire. It's going to be a gig economy. You know, you're going to have 5 or 6 sort of smaller income earning positions. Like I looked at Amazon Mechanical Turk, and with Amazon Mechanical Turk, it's like, you know, you want 1,000 pictures to be tagged. Well, I think you can do that, or you can give it to us and we'll give it to 500 people and we'll pay them and they'll do 2 pictures each. And I was thinking, well, who are these people who are doing this? And as generally, it's North Americans on their commute to work, and they're doing this for a bit of extra money. So I think Crowdthreat really kind of fits in with that sort of gig economy as almost like a side hustle. And if you're a student and you've got real interest in threat intelligence, then you come on here, you could make some additional money. But also some of the work that we're working on at the moment is where you can actually link to your profile. So you could report, say, you're doing a thesis into Saudi Arabia, and as part of that, you've come up with the platform, you create a load of data in relation to Saudi Arabia, and then you go to the job market and you part of CV, you can say, well, I've done 1,500 instances on Crowdthreat in relation to Saudi Arabia, and actually here's a hyperlink to my profile, and you can actually see the data that I've collected. So I think we're trying to kind of look at it from a few different ways, of not just the earning potential, but the ability for people to actually use the work that they do with us to support and help their career going forward.
It's a really interesting idea, actually, like that idea of like having almost like a portfolio of work that you could pull back on and refer to kind of back up that, you know, yeah, I did this training course, or I've got like these education academic back qualifications, but here's how I've actually applied that in real life. And I think that could be really difficult to get into from like the intelligence space, just because the nature of a lot of the work is either usually sensitive or, you know, very client confidential, and therefore you're like, I can't really talk about any of the specifics. But one time I investigated LinkedIn, just said like the end. Like that can be really difficult. I feel like this whole space, and like you mentioned, like gig economy and stuff, like the increased decentralization of many things, I think is a really interesting space. And I think I haven't seen many uses where the like intelligence community has kind of leaned into that very heavily. I know in the UK there's a company called Valinor that are doing something kind of similar, where they're almost bringing analysts together and then either going after like contracts and introducing like paid opportunities, or like opportunities for like internships and stuff like that. But outside of that, I don't really see very much in that sort of space. And it's something I think is, you know, really valid, because actually if you're really interested in investigating a specific kind of discipline or a specific kind of subject, and you could bring other people in on that to support that, then actually you don't need to be like part of a huge consultancy to provide like really valuable work, and you could build like a really viable career off the back of that, because you all have complementary skills and could almost function as like a really good analyst team. So it's a really interesting model. I think there's a lot of people in the community as well that would be really interested in participating in something like that, especially those, like you said, maybe students, maybe junior career, and looking for some of that body of work to help embellish their CVs a little bit and also get some real hands-on practical experience and things. It's difficult in the UK a little bit because I guess we have less incidents to report more than I guess somewhere like Sudan, Iraq, or Afghanistan. But there's still things that happen. There's still things that are going on. And I think, there are companies all around the world, right? So actually, it might be useful if there's even like, I'm thinking like just silly things like there's a real bad traffic jam here, like this kind of location. But if you're a logistics firm, that might be really important information if it's on like a major road that you want to have a lot of traffic going through. And that kind of information, which you might be able to get from Twitter or some sites like that, but it can be kind of fly by night and maybe you don't get it in real time, or it's really easy to miss because, just the sheer volumes of data. So I see there's so many avenues we could go down. I think that's a really, really fascinating idea. So I'm interested. So at the moment you are building a company. I guess, how do you see this evolving over the next 2 to 3 years? And do you see like almost, I guess, like I've just referenced there, like, do you see pockets of analysts coming together, or do you see like little regional hubs and things like that being set up as well, where people might come together or cross-reference each other's work?
I think there's so many different elements that you can look at this. Like the first thing whenever I talk about crowdsourcing, people say is, well, how do you ensure the accuracy of data? So like within the platform itself, we have a reporting path to trust. So when you first start on the platform, we check 100% of what you're reporting. And then over time, once you've proved to yourself to be accurate, then you move to the second level and the third level and so on through the system. And we check less and less of what you produce because you've proven yourself to be accurate. Which by the way is exactly the same way as any other intelligence company would operate. They would just say, well, we're going to do 2 weeks of training. You'll have some sort of line manager who's monitoring their work, and then they'll do sort of like spot checks on certain threats. And that's exactly what we do. We just do it at the larger scale. So that's kind of that key element. I mean, certainly in terms of the like crowdsourcing and essentially building a crowd of people and getting them to report threats. I've done that previously with my last company, except we called it an internship program. We essentially became the training wing for a lot of our competitors. A very small company in the northeast of England. We'd have an internship program with German universities called the Security Institute. We take 30 interns per year, but we'd also get people who would directly apply. And over the course of, this is how we kind of got the company going. Over the course of 3 or 4 years, we must have had about 200 internships where they come to us, we take them through the fundamentals of intelligence, they get experience of reporting incidents within our platform, and then they'd go off and fantastically, they've gone off to work for some of the biggest companies that are out there, which is amazing. And that's kind of where I looked at that. Well, it's, they can turn around and say, well, I used to cover this country, I covered that region, but they couldn't evidence it through the technology, which is why we sort of built that element, or we're building that element in the crowd, how we can actually link to it. So I think my goal at the moment in Bayesian is just to grow the crowd and ensure the crowd are engaged with the platform. Then after that, it's ensuring that we have the consistency and the accuracy of the data, and we begin to sort of fill out the regions globally. At the moment, we've got heavy coverage in the US, in parts of Europe, in Nigeria, in India, and parts of Asia, because that's kind of where the crowd are coming from. But, I literally want crowd members reporting on every single country in the world. So like you mentioned before, kind of sometimes sort of investors or whoever get involved and they're like, well, we need to turn a profit on this or we need to do whatever. At the moment, this is a family-run business. And the reason why I'm doing it is because I have an interest in intelligence, and I'd love to understand how the world works. And I want to create a single platform where I can go to and actually see everything that's happening around the world. I want to kind of democratize that by that element of it. So that's kind of why I'm doing it. So yeah, the goal is to prove the Web 2 element, and then after that, we're going to start moving on to the Web 3. So that's kind of tokenization in the platform, creating a Crowdthreat token, doing monthly buybacks with fiat currency to ensure there's that element where you can actually make money from it, and then moving down the smart contract route where you can perhaps upload a an intelligence assessment that you do on a weekly basis or whatever, and actually make money from that. So that's kind of where I want to eventually do. I want to completely change how intelligence intellectual property is owned in the sector, and kind of moving it away from the big companies and moving it down to the actual, the people who are creating the content.
No, it's a really interesting model, right? Really fascinating to me. And so I'm interested. So do you see a point where you start to integrate data into the platform as well? So as an analyst is reporting something, can they then bring like third-party sources in to corroborate and support what they have provided as well? Well, I guess almost like in my head, I'm thinking like almost like an all-in-one package where this is what I'm seeing on the ground. Here's something to corroborate that, and to help embellish like that reporting process.
I mean, that kind of seems like where some of the market leaders are going around the agentic AI side. So it's like, this plane has crashed at this location. We're going to use one of our agents to go in, gather the weather from the timing at that location. Potentially, but it would probably be data that we don't cover. So like we don't generally cover things like weather and hazards data. Because there are other companies out there who are doing that far more effectively than a crowd. So potentially sort of incorporating that sort of data. But even things like, when it comes to sort of future-looking analysis, like if you take climate change as an example, there are sort of companies out there who've done climate models who are saying, right, in 30, 40 years' time, these parts of the world are going to be completely impacted by climate change. Now, these are sort of data sets that, from a strategic level perspective, allow you to really understand or provide scenarios as to how the world is going to change. We're going to see an increase in migration, which is then going to have certain impacts on, how societies are politically, potential for sort of civil unrest, these sorts of things. So whilst we sit at the tactical level at the moment, trying to build that tactical level data set and try and make it as real time as possible, putting through predictive stuff, so pan demonstrations, those sorts of things, where eventually I'd love to get to actually bring in data sets that allow the crowd to do really great future looking assessment, but assessment with bites. I've never been afraid, or I've said to my analyst, I don't care what you write, it may be controversial as long as you can back up what you say with evidence. Amazing, let's do it. And people have always said that about my previous company, that our assessment always had a bit of bite to it. And I think we have to ask difficult questions. I think that's what our job is intelligence analysts. But like, we are a crowdsourced platform. We should be open to the crowd providing ideas as to what sort of, where they want the platform to go and what data sets potentially they want us to kind of go in.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we have a tendency, particularly where we get companies that might be politically sensitive, or you're reporting about something that could be politically sensitive. Like, I use the example where I've been in a position before when asked to look at somebody's digital footprint, and you write a report, and then in that report you have some information which, it's not illegal, but it might be embarrassing. They have accounts on certain websites where they watch people take off their underwear or something like that. And, like it's embarrassing for them potentially, but it's not the end of the world. But then people are like, oh, maybe we need to remove that from the report, or we need to anonymize it in some way. Like, well, you're completely defeating the purpose of what the objective is here. Like, we want to protect this person, and if we skirt around the fact that we might have to have an awkward conversation about their viewing habits on the internet, we should still be doing that, because ultimately our goal is to protect that person. And I guess to bring that around back into real world instance, if there's an explosion in a place that is, politically contentious and people are very for or very against something happening, you still need to report on it in a factually accurate way. And you can't hide the fact that maybe the side that people prefer might have done something that is affecting other people. And I think we're in a really contentious time, particularly on social media, where I think people are too far, one side versus another. It's very combative, very easy to fall down those rabbit holes and be very almost radicalized against the other side of whatever argument it is. And almost nowadays, it feels like you could pick any subject and there is somebody who's radically against whatever you might think. But I think being able to do bringing that back into the intelligence space is really dangerous. And being able to back that up and provide intelligence reports. And if somebody's turning around saying your intelligence reports have bite to them because you're just reporting on the facts and you have the receipts to like show this is what the data is suggesting and this is what our analytical judgment is, that's a really good face. That's a really good thing. That's where everyone should be. And if people are not doing that, then there's a bigger problem that we should be answering as an industry and as a community. And there's a lot of subjects which people work on inside the space, which is sensitive, touches on a lot of crime. Some of the crimes are abhorrent and like really uncomfortable to talk about. And the last webinar I did was around image abuse and deepfakes and non-consensual sharing of imagery and videos. And these are conversations that we need to have and things that we need to be able to support and get to the bottom of, regardless of whatever somebody believes. And taking a crowdsourced view and actually being able to bring that information into one place, saying this is verified from people that are in the location and can give us that context that we really need. This is what we actually think is happening. I think that's a really powerful thing. I think I can see this becoming a really, really powerful platform over the next 2 to 3 years and probably beyond. I think bringing that to like geopolitics and things, how the world seems to be on a bit of a knife edge in all sorts of different places, that kind of information is going to become increasingly important, especially as disinformation, misinformation is just going to increase rapidly on social media. So I think you're really in an interesting space at a really interesting time. How would people get involved if they wanted to?
I mean, you can go to crowdthreat.com, click the sign in button, and then you can register for an account. Once you register for an account, we then take you through an onboarding process, which essentially just tells you like, this is how we report threats. These are the things we're interested in. Those are the things we're not interested in. And then after that, you have access to the platform and you can start to report threats. And it's a really easy process to do it. You kind of support it by AI. We always need a source. We need to know where you got the information from. And eventually we might move away from that because you less be seeing things that you just don't have a source in relation to it. But at the moment we have to have a source in relation to the threats that you provide. And then that's it. You provide it to us, we verify it internally. And then once we accept it, your wallet, and the money hits your internal wallet. And once you're over £20, you can withdraw it from Crowdthreat, and we have monthly bonus payments of top prize of £500 and £300 and £200. I think it's really interesting kind of seeing the competitive element. Like I've always seen this with intelligence and there's always, someone really, really competitive and often quite competitive with themselves. I know analysts who have like, daily counts of incidents that they've done and they're trying to sort of these counts. So it's interesting kind of seeing that from the gamification perspective. Yeah, that's how you can get involved with it.
That's a really interesting point around like you're almost fighting yourself on a daily basis. I guess what would be interesting off that is how much do like reports typically get paid out at the moment?
So if you report a threat that you've caught within 15 minutes of it occurring, then we pay you £1.50 for that threat. And it's kind of a sliding scale. So all the way down to kind of within the 24 to 48 hour window, we pay you 25 pence for these reports. The future looking threat is 50 pence. It's like a PAN demonstration. It's 50 pence per threat report. What we are looking at is potentially creating the ability for us to amend the pricing to make it a bit more dynamic, because like I'm conscious that over the Christmas period we see a drop in threat reporting. So like, do I then sort of increase like double the value, for example, through this period, or we're kind of seeing specific days where we have lower levels. So I think we're eventually going to move to more of like a dynamic pricing, but that's the sort of the 7 levels where we pay for threats.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense as well, because obviously during the course of the whole year we're going to see almost supply and demand, right, around different events and things that have either huge potential risks to like I guess a large number of people, or it's an event where there's going to be a lot of people who are influential at, and things like that would be really interesting and presumably a bit more valuable than I guess I used earlier like a traffic report. Like, might not be quite the same impact. So in terms of the reports themselves, as an OSINT community, I guess, do you see that the reporting would be heavily influenced from open source intelligence itself. Like I've been doing research on, I don't know, something like Telegram, because you mentioned like planned demonstrations and things like that. So I saw in a Telegram group that this group have claimed they're going to be at these locations, and also they're threatening to do these things at the event, versus I am on the ground. I guess an example would be like the terror attack in Australia last week, where somebody on the ground might see something happening and be able to very quickly report something with like video evidence. And I guess both of those things would be very, very valuable, but I guess also getting to that point that the analysts shouldn't be putting themselves in harm's way or in a position where they're at risk because something is happening. So I guess that leaning on that open source background and still being able to verify enough of what's going on locally is really, really important.
Yeah. I mean, I saw the difference from like when I first started working in Iraq in the private security sector, like 2010, we really started reading local Iraqi media, speaking to the locals, asking them questions. And then Syria began. And when Syria began, you had these sort of armchair analysts who sat there monitoring the conflict, who are sort of providing amazing content. And I think probably some of these sort of armchair analysts don't understand how widely that is used, even into sort of, security services and governments and militaries. And what we're kind of trying to tap into is that sort of Reddit crowd. I'd see sort of terror attacks occur and someone create a Reddit thread and put like 200 people in sort of working through that instant and trying to collate as much data as possible. All we're doing is creating a platform where it's built to actually consume that data, but also you get rewarded and paid for that data. And I mean, part of the onboarding process is like, we are not only placing for the 999 service of 911. And, if there is an incident happening in front of you, you should be calling the police in relation to that. We're there to sort of, it's the open source intelligence community. That's who we want to tap into, that global open source intelligence community of people who have an interest in this and perhaps want to get started in this sector and perhaps don't know where to do that. That's kind of who we really want to tap into. So generally, it's them providing us URLs of stuff that they've found online in relation to this stuff.
That makes sense. And I guess it's kind of similar in a lot of ways to how Bellingcat kind of got formed about, it must have been like 12 years ago. That whole like crowdsource movement, tracking things in, I want to say it was Iraq originally, and then slowly it became Ukraine. And then before you know it, there's this whole like media giant now, I guess, doing really, really insightful, interesting reporting. And also, I guess, really interesting, you mentioned like the Reddit crowd as well. Like, there's like a whole universe out there, untapped potential for analysts. So I think that's something that's a really interesting concept, and seeing how quickly that kind of information could become really valuable in a way where you do like that verification and that analysis and stuff, actually taking all that noise away from, particularly where there's small teams who don't have enough analysts to be able to digest all of that information and take their time with things. That's actually a really powerful like force multiplier for their analysis and their investigations. I think it's a really interesting concept that I can see a lot of people latching onto. And I think like the possibility then to, earn a few quid as a bit of a side hustle is also quite nice, but also gives you, like I said, like rather than just getting like a thumbs up from somebody who works for The Sun and wants to put something in a newspaper article, actually getting something that is some form of reward and will be there, to collect, also gives you that incentivization to then think about, well, what else could I contribute? Where else could I put this to use? What other conflicts or regions could I analyze? And I guess, like you said, also that ability to then also change focus a little bit and look at different things, because you're reliant on the OSINT as a background as well. And then before you know it, you maybe, I used to research a lot of Sudan, but now I'm looking more in like Syria, because that's where a lot of the things that I was interested in have now moved over to, and sort of understanding what's happening in those conflict zones. I guess you still might need that local knowledge and that local like feel for a lot of that stuff. But I guess that's then where the beauty comes in, where you could then almost, I guess, to quote your last company of fusion, bring all that together and almost have that fusion center approach where people are looking at it from slightly different angles. You're getting that local context, you're getting maybe some OSINT expertise, and bringing it all together to actually really understand what's going on, which I think gives you the opportunity as well, I guess, as a company to put out like really interesting reporting based off the stuff that your users are generating as well.
Yeah. Like that's part of, like at the moment, there's a lot of companies are just using open source intelligence. They're not using, multi-source. So, in the military, we'll use satellite imagery to corroborate human or other SIGINT. So I think there's an option from a feed perspective to add things like satellite imagery into the platform, which I think is really, really useful. Like I used to use the example of like the analogy of the global threat intelligence picture as a jigsaw puzzle. And we have all the pieces. They're just scattered in different rooms, different people hold them. You just got to find out ability to sort of bring all those pieces together. How things are changing now, though, is that if you kind of look at AI and deepfakes and these sorts of things, you have technology and bad actors who are creating incorrect pieces and adding them into the board for you to try and work out, should this actually go there or not? You have AIs out there sort of creating its own puzzle and saying, this is how I got it, and you have no idea whether or not it's accurate or not. All we're trying to do here at Crowdthreat is just provide that kind of central hub for people to come together and bring their own pieces and actually get a lot of bringing pieces together and allowing us to create that jigsaw puzzle. Where we finally actually understand, because how do you actually understand a problem if you can't identify the problem? And I think that's part of the issue that we have at the moment. We have journalists who, certainly in the UK, when you look at the sort of trust levels of professionals, they're down there with politicians. And that's a terrible position for us to be in as the world becomes a more so threat-rich place. I think you have an opportunity to do what journalists should be doing and actually providing a true understanding as to how the world actually works. And as intelligence analysts, we should be independent, we should put our clickbaits aside and search for the truth. And I think there's an opportunity to do that with the crowdsourced threat intelligence platform. So yeah, it's a jigsaw puzzle. It's just getting a bit more difficult to put together.
I think that's a really, really important point as well, because I guess even with all their best intentions, a lot of journalists will still be driven by whatever the editor decides and also what direction they need the story to go in for whatever purpose. And I guess the obvious one there is political biases on either side of the fence. But actually having something which is decentralized, crowdsourced, and is based purely on the facts that are available and that local context and knowledge should theoretically provide a much more comprehensive or better understood reality of a situation versus, oh, well, this newspaper said that, this person committed the attack because they have this belief, but this newspaper said, no, it wasn't that at all. It was the complete opposite. And I think a really good example of that was the Charlie Kirk assassination, where there was a lot of probably unintentional misinformation in like the immediate aftermath of that. But before you know it, it was like, oh, he was a far right extremist. No, he's a far left extremist. And like it was very messy trying to understand exactly what's happened, which can be really frustrating if you're then in that position where you're like, well, we're doing executive protection in this area and we need to understand what's going on, because he's a public figure and it could be not politically motivated, just this will get eyes on something for some other purpose, which you can't necessarily always do in a journalistic capacity, because your editor's probably going to be like, no, we're not publishing that because you're not saying the right thing. Or we're going to edit what you've written to suggest something else. And I guess probably where a lot of distrust comes with politicians as well. I'm also interested, so your background's obviously very much in this intelligence space, both physically on the ground, but also like now more in this OSINT space. So I'm interested what your personal like favorite techniques are. Is there something that you rely on quite heavily when you're doing some research and analysis yourself?
It's a great question. I love technology and I love kind of keeping up to date with the latest tools that are out there. Even just from stuff like historic, that ability to move tweets from Twitter to a Google Sheet and then be able to analyze it. Like we would do that for like TWB Manchester Arena as an example. We did that using one of the tools that are out there, because then what you can do is actually you can order it from a date and time perspective and see, well, actually, is there anything in relation to Manchester Arena that occurred before the Manchester Arena policy? But now as we're kind of moving through to AI, I mean, I use Gemini, I use ChatGPT, and I use Grok. I mean, even just from like a startup perspective and like building a company, how much more efficient I am now than with my previous company, because I almost have three, all-rounder experts with a huge data set that I can tap into to ask questions of. So AI obviously is absolutely fantastic. I'm very visual from an intelligence perspective. My previous company, like the first marketing that we used to do was we would put out pictorial intelligence units, which was, it's just what I do with the army. And they weren't really being done at the time. That this was kind of a real novel approach. So like, I think the future of intelligence we've got to move away from, one, I don't think people like to read anymore. I really don't. I think you've got like 5 seconds to get people's attention. So I think certainly from a platform perspective, you need to engage with media and visual, and that's kind of what I want to do with Crowdthreat. Is I don't want people to come platform and having to read reams and reams of text in relation to a thread. I'm kind of looking for new visual ways to kind of disseminate that intelligence to them. So yeah, and it's such a fast changing pace as well now that. I'm hoping as part of the crowd effort is we're tapping into people who are really at the forefront from a technology perspective to kind of capture this data. So part of this is kind of just almost outsourcing innovation to the world and just looking and seeing, right, who's out there who's really innovative at actually creating this data, and come to Crowdthreat and we're paying for that innovation to actually collect the data within our system.
That's a really interesting point, because you are probably the 4th or 5th person I've spoken to this year that has said that around like the intelligence reporting process. And I think we're all guilty that we write too many words. But a lot of the time it's kind of hard, right? Because you're trying to convey the point, or you're trying to answer a specific question, and you're trying to be as useful as possible. But ultimately, and I'm really guilty of this. Like, if I'm doing like an OSINT report, I'm like, right, here's all the things I have that were found. And half the time, it's like, well, does the customer actually care about one thing? Just tell them the one thing. I was talking to a guy a couple months ago, and he said like a lot of the clients his company has are in like the venture capitalist private equity space, and they're all a little bit TikTok generation. And he's like, so we've started to experiment with like delivering our like, I guess like intelligence summaries and stuff in different formats, because they're just used to like short form videos, and that's how they ingest most of their content. So using like apps like Notebook LM, to create a podcast, and still giving you the kind of same information, but in a format that you're more used to or more likely to consume than here's a PDF that's 300 pages. Or then creating like, short form videos for like, here's an intelligence summary in 60 seconds. Number 1, this person's bad. Second point, that person did a thing. You're up to date. Have a great day.
Yeah.
It sounds, for the traditionalist in me, it sounds, abhorrent that we would do that. But actually that's the way we've evolved as a society now, and a lot of the content side. And why shouldn't we adapt to that as intelligence professionals if we're still conveying the same points and we're still providing the same value and the same information? Giving people that content in a way that makes sense for them is what we should be doing, not just because we went to school 20 years ago and this is how you write an intelligence report. And okay, that's how I write an intelligence report forever, regardless of what somebody might want or need.
Well, does a client want to read, 3 pages, or do they want to just jump on a call for 5 minutes with the person who is looking at that region and just ask the questions in relation to, and understand from the analyst's perspective how it's actually going to impact them?
Yeah.
That for me is 100% the way that you should go, like, especially with a crowdsourced network of potentially subject matter experts around the world. That ability to say, oh, that person did that report, I'd like to now have a call with them. I'm going to pay them for their time to go and speak to them. Or perhaps, it's you create a weekly briefing or a weekly podcast, or like it's got to be different mediums, but it's got to be as accessible and as easy to digest as possible, which often is just having a conversation with someone.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us are guilty in this space because we're probably too used to being in those spaces where we feel like the data is sensitive, or it's like it's our secrets and it's our information and we're holding it forever. But ultimately, like, if we're doing this stuff and it's all derived from open source research and investigations, at some point somebody else is going to talk about this, because there's enough people in the community at large that we aren't going to be the only people that see this. And if we are, then why are we not taking the glory for it? And I think a lot of that will boil down to the fact, like, why would I talk about this report in like a podcast? Like, no, it's my baby. But actually, no, if your customer's like, I need a 10-minute, like, just give me a 10-minute audio note, voice note or something. Just let me know what's going on. And if what I need to know is bad, good, indifferent, or if I need to just get out of town because something bad is going to happen. Like, ultimately, that's all they care about. And whether or not you write a report to help you as an analyst convey those messages, I guess, is up to you if that's how you can best describe it. Because I find if I was to just try and talk my way through a multi-go graph, I might get lost.
Yeah.
But when I'm taking my time to write a report and I'm referring to my multi-go graph, it's easier for me because a bit like you, I like the visual aspects and I can see the links between the data, but maybe not in the same way that I would talk to you on a call like this and say, oh yeah, this information was linked to that and that information was that and blah, blah, blah at the end. Because, I like to take my time and actually go through it and analyze it. But figuring out the best ways for the client to interpret that content, I think is going to be super important. And the idea of actually doing videos, I think, is really interesting, or short form content in whatever format the client would choose.
OSINT is a great unifier, especially when it comes to sort of protected markets. Like I had a US general who's based in NATO who messaged me on LinkedIn and just purely to say that my previous company, like I love the content that you guys put out because I can just print this off and I can go to this Romanian general and I can have a conversation with that person about it, which I couldn't do because of the protected market systems that we're operating in NATO. So I think, OSINT practitioners sometimes perhaps just don't have the exposure to understand how high up the OSINT reporting goes and how much it's used by governments and militaries and agencies.
Yeah, and I guess that conception or preconceived notion that, well, they would have all the better information anyway. I was like, well, no, because none of these organizations are omnipotent. And sure, they might have relationships with the government in the country in question that you're interested in. And surely the government might have some information that's useful to them, but then it's probably on using some sort of technology or capability that is never going to be publicly avowed. And therefore they can't really discuss it in a way that, like you just said, is really open. Whereas if I can see some information that I've pulled from a blog post a company has written that's purely derived from open source information and talks exactly about the things I'm interested in, and I can go over here and talk to this person, and we can refer to this information specifically, and then have a conversation at a level that we can have, then maybe actually really accelerating the pace at which things can be done. And I think in that more closed space in the intelligence community, you sometimes hide behind the fact that your capabilities are sensitive or secret, and therefore, like, the willingness to accept that open source exists and could in some cases be better than what you might be able to find from a sensitive resource is probably a difficult one to get your head around. Particularly if you've not been in the open source space for a long period, I think. And I think as a community, we've done a really good job over the last 5 to 10 years of professionalizing it and coming out of the shadows and actually legitimizing like OSINT as not only as a capability, but a career option. I think around 10 years ago, there wasn't really much by way of career opportunities in the space. And if there were, you had to be from the military or law enforcement. And that's both a blessing and a curse, I think, in a lot of ways, because, you get an analyst that has a certain background and a certain level of understanding sort of straight off the bat, which you might not get from somebody coming directly from the private sector. But at the same time, the private sector will give you other useful experiences and things, which if you're in a room full of military people, probably don't have any real world job experience of like being in a business and like how to grow a business. So you get a really good combination of backgrounds and experience. And I guess diversity of thought as well, which is a really important thing to consider as well.
I can't say this to the analysts in my last company because generally they were interns who were just hired full-time internally at the company. And I'd say to them, The issue is you've not been exposed to the wider intelligence community, because I know based on the sheer quantity of data that you process at a tactical level, you are far more knowledgeable about certain topics and issues. Like when I was in the military, I knew Iraq, I knew Afghanistan, and I knew the DRC, because that's kind of where we had operations or I did testing. Whereas the sheer quantity of data that the analysts in the last community were operating on, I'd say to them, I'd stack you up against any analyst that worked with any data. But because they hadn't had that exposure, there's almost that imposter syndrome. And I think that can be felt within the Aussie community. And certainly agencies that I've been exposed to, one, they have to have that almost that omnipotent aura about them. So the criminals have that feeling as if, perpetual is being watched. Yeah, we did a project for an agency and they gave us 2 specific RFIs and we went away and collected on it for 30 days, came back and I went down to brief on it. And I walked in, I was fully expecting them to say, well, we know this, we are such and such an agency. And we had all the directors of the different branches there. And one was like, on this specific question, I've been spending 6 months looking for this. And I'm thinking, it's just there on open source. All you had to do is go out there and commit it. And this is this, similarly from a private intelligence perspective and public intelligence perspective, it comes to scalability. We don't have thousands and thousands of people doing this, so we can't scale both in the public and the private sector. But with a crowd, you can't scale.
Yeah, I guess another important point there is that almost like that tunnel vision that you can get where you only know of like the capabilities or the tools and resources that you have access to. And sometimes it's just really useful to get a fresh pair of eyes on the same thing. And yeah, you might feel stupid that you spent 6 months looking at something and you've not been able to find that bit of information and somebody's walked in and said, oh, I did that for like a day and here we are. But ultimately, like if you get into that trap where you're just always going down that rabbit hole and looking at the same things in the same way, in the same thought process, actually referring somebody like from the private sector to come in and give it like that slightly different point of view and maybe slightly different tooling and slightly different mindset suddenly opens up that whole possibility for better collaboration as well. Michael, this has been a really interesting conversation. I feel like we've talked to you all day. But I'm also aware that we've been talking for like over an hour and there's a whole Christmas period to get to. So I want to thank you immensely for your time, because you must be really busy at the moment in the middle of the beta period, trying to launch a platform and a community, which, talking to this idiot is really distracting from that. So thank you so much for taking the time. How may our community find either you or Crowdthreat online if they want to find out some more information?
Just go to crowdthreat.com and you'll find them there. And I'm on LinkedIn, Michael McCabe. You can find me very easy.
Amazing. That was easy. So
thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. And to everybody watching this, thanks so much. I'm not entirely sure when this airs. So if it's before Christmas, happy Christmas. If it's between Christmas and New Year, hope you had a good Christmas and have a happy New Year. And if it's post January 1st, well, I'm sorry, it's January. It is what it is. Stay tuned to the UK OSINT community. We've got more educational content and videos coming your way. And we have news on upcoming events coming very, very soon. So thank you for watching and goodbye.